You guys hit the one on the other table, so it's green. Thanks. Okay. Alright. Welcome everybody to the Hood River Budget Committee meeting. This is the first one of 3. And as chair? Chair. Yay, it's my last time being chair. Yay, finally. Is it? Yeah, I know. Thanks. First order of business, calling the meeting order, which I did. Next up is to appoint a new chair. Is there a voluntold person that would like to do that? Raise your hand or.
I was volunteering.
Thanks, Joe.
I think you need
Is there anyone who would like to nominate Joe to be chair?
I'll nominate Joe.
I'll second that.
There's a motion and a second to nominate Joe to be chair. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thanks for everyone's side. Thanks for being new chair.
No,
To help out, Joe, is there anybody that would like to volunteer to be vice chair?
I'll volunteer to be vice chair.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. Is there anyone who would like to nominate Gary for vice chair?
I'll nominate Gary.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second to nominate Gary for vice chair. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Congrats, Gary, you're vice chair. And with that, I turn power over to Joe. Take it away, Joe. And you can basically turn it over to Abby.
I'm gonna turn this over to Abigail.
Yeah.
She's ready.
And now you're in charge.
Great. I'll make this back. No, I think we should figure it out.
Oh, okay. Let's start with introductions. We'll start that side of the table and go around.
So Chris Longinetti, Finance Director to the City of Hood River. Graham Berg, volunteer. Rudy Kellner.
Doug Stepina, Hood River City Councilor, and I chair the Urban Renewal Advisory Board. Can't talk to them.
Gary Reed.
Brandon Cameron.
Tina McPherson.
Abel.
Grant Polson, my titles don't matter.
Abigail Elder, City Manager.
Joe Sheehan, Budget Committee Chair.
Ben Mitchell, my titles do matter. Hood River City Councilor.
And we have Mayor Blackburn, Councilor Amanda Gakey, and Councilor Gladys Rivera are on their way.
Okay. And then we did that, the officers, so now we need to approve.
The minutes from last year, because
From
it's been a year
la-
since you met.
Yeah, so we need a motion to approve the minutes from May 8th and May 15th of 2024.
So moved. Second.
We have a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Passes, motion passes. And then now we turn the presentation over to Abigail.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well done.
Good job, Joe.
Thank you all. Some of you, it's been a year since I've seen you. Welcome back. I'm glad that you're here. With the exception of a couple of our new counselors, I think everybody is returning to this budget committee. So it's great to have a group that's experienced and has been here before. So I have a very short presentation because let's be honest, I'm just giving you a big picture. I'm giving you the fluff, and then we get to the meat and potatoes when we get to our finance director, Chris Longinetti. So let me just share my screen here. Chris might be able to talk to this more, but we've definitely heard from other cities, the League of Oregon Cities and others that, and you might have seen in the media, lots of cities are struggling. Salem, Portland, McMinnville are all looking at major cuts. I am happy to say that Hood River is financially stable and in pretty good shape. And I'm really thankful to all of you and to the work of past city councils and past budget committees that have really done the hard work to keep this city in good financial shape. Now, I say that with a bit of looking forward, I always feel anxious about where we are and where we're going, but the city has somewhat diverse revenue sources, and we've done a good job of keeping spending in line, so feel good about that. Some specifics, as we said, we've just been through the agenda, today's agenda. I'm going to give you just an overview, and then we turn over to Chris, and I think Chris is going to talk a little bit about in the administrative budget, just because that's something that affects all of the other budgets. So today is really about setting those foundations, and then our next meeting we will talk more in depth about specific departments. So thank you all for being members. I'm proud that this budget committee is fully staffed. Just heard from another city that has no They don't have any other, they don't have non-council members on their committee, so I'm really proud that we have such good representation from our community. Today is our first budget meeting. Like I said, today is that foundational day. Next week, we'll talk about the general fund and the building department fund. And then the 21st, everybody's favorite, because Adam's gonna bring us a great show, I know he will, with Public Works and Urban Renewal. Come on in, there's a spot there and a spot there. And then the 21st is also, we have a public hearing, so you notice today on the agenda, there was no spot for public comments. We saved that for the last meeting, so if we get any public comments in writing, Jen will send them out to you ahead of time. Or we will have a spot if anybody wants to come and present. And then you make your recommendation for the council reviews and considers the budget on June 9th. And of course, our new fiscal year starts on July 1st. As you know, the city really focuses on three things that are day to day. We often use the iceberg analogy of like, a lot of the stuff that you see is up here, but under that surface, there's a lot of things happening, and those really fall in three main buckets, and that's community infrastructure, that's parks, that's roads, that's pipes, it's our vehicles, it's the things that help to keep the city running, public safety, EMS, right, ambulance, fire, police, and then finally community standards, by which I mean our sign code, our building code, our land use planning program, all of the pieces that make Hood River a special place. So those are things that often don't get seen at the council meeting, they're not often in the press, but those are the day-to-day work that we're always doing. We receive policy direction from a lot of different places, the charter, city charter, the comprehensive plan, but these 6 plans are notable. The one on the upper left is the new city council priority or work plan, that's a 2-year plan. I'm always happy to share copies with it if anybody wants some extra reading. That's new this year. It's the first time we've done it again in 2 years. Affordable housing strategy that was done in I think 2022 that really informs one of the council's main priorities, which is to make housing more accessible for community members. Transportation system plan, and then the ones on the bottom are plans in which the city is a member but not necessarily the main author. And so one is the multi-jurisdictional parks master plan. That includes, I'm not sure if I could name them all, city, county, parks district, port, school district, I don't know, maybe library, like all of the parks in all the places. The Safe Roads to School plan, and then the Hood River County energy plan, which includes the port, the county, the city, and the port of Cascade Locks. So these are all of the areas where we take a lot of our direction, and it informs how we write this budget. The mentioned council met, they met in December, both the incoming and outgoing council, to review the status of current projects and to set goals for the next 2 years. And so these were the main topic areas, and we have a matrix with all of the projects that they have prioritized. So you can see housing continues to be one of council's transportation. Well-maintained and safe community, this is our kitchen sink, this is where we put our police, we put fire, we put a lot of our day-to-day work. Environmentally sustainable and resilient community, when we think about being fire-wise, we think about solar on our fire station, think about how we can make sure that we eventually reach carbon neutral or energy neutral, focus on the importance of our staff, our facilities. We did have some grants that we thought we were going to receive that we probably will not. One was for electric vehicles, that with federal funds going to DEQ coming to us. We had another one for smaller housing units, that was a EPA, it was EPA to DEQ to us. None of those things have started, so we're not out any dollars, but it is disappointing that those opportunities are probably lost. State concerns, the state legislature is meeting right now, so watching that very closely. Some new mandates about the development review process, and just I don't know that it'll add, but it might add like timeliness, and so will it require more staff resources to move things faster. PERS and our transit system, always worried about that. And then a lot of focus right now on transportation. Have you heard anything about ODOT's funding shortages? So we're anxious about that because cities, of course, receive some gas tax dollars. Plus, we've had a lot of projects with ODOT that have cost the city. And then just a note that generally the city gets shut out of some grant opportunities because we have a high median household income. So for example, in the past, USDA grants or rural development grants through USDA seemed like a perfect fit for some of the things we're looking for. I've talked to them about.
No, I
2 minutes are up.
I had a timer on you.
But we were never eligible for that because the median household income of Hood River is higher than what the grant would allow. And so that continues to be a story that we want to tell, that it's more than just the statistics. When I talk to our national representatives, their staff, I try to always say that, like, there's more to the story than just what you see in the statistics about our high median income. That often does not show how hard our housing and other struggles are. We always try to be responsible. As I said, we're in pretty good shape compared to a lot of cities. A big part of that is the responsible stewardship that you have done. We just had an audit review at our last meeting. It was excellent. And some of the budget policies that are in your book talk about the one-time versus ongoing costs. That's a big part of the school district. Other areas that they used ARPA and other one-time dollars for ongoing things, and now they have to make cuts. I'm very proud that Chris and council have worked through a system development charges study that was holistic. It's the first time we ever looked at all of our system development charges and adopted a new schedule. I'm hopeful that we don't have to do that again for quite a while because we have set a good foundation. And we do a utility rate study every 5 years, and I think we're coming up on that. So we'll probably see that next year. We try to seek outside funding where appropriate. So piece of news I don't think I've shared with council yet is we have received or will receive a state fire marshal grant for firefighter coverage. This is for overtime and for other coverage. It's not the wildfire fuel reduction, but this is a grant we've received in the past. This year, I think it'll be about $30,000. The state legislature has provided funds in Mariposa Village, our affordable housing for water related infrastructure. I think that's $2.4 million. And then we have, and we'll talk about this when we talk about urban renewal, legislative request for jurisdictional transfer funding. So we are actively seeking dollars where we can find them that those put all of the burden on our taxpayers. Other funding options I've got there, new fees and assessments. I think last year I talked about we had started a new RV dumping fee. I think that has raised a few dollars. We are looking at, and we could possibly do some debt supported by some of our restricted funds, and I think we'll talk about that later. I don't think that's today. And then council said as one of its priorities, a possible bond measure in November 2026. So we'll start working on what that might look like. And that's a bond would be like a general obligation bond that would go out to voters. Some of the things that we started or completed this year, you can see this kind of list. I want to note the first one is a lawsuit. We did not anticipate coming, but we've been working on it for a while. This is Panabaker versus the city of Hood River. This is about short-term rentals and the city's requirement that you must live here and not, not just rent a second home. It was very decisive in the motion to dismiss at the district court level. Felt like we got a very good opinion in favor of the city. We have heard that the Panabaker and other parties plan to appeal that, so that will continue. And we'll talk a little bit about legal costs coming up this today. The other big thing we're working on development. We finished a development code audit. Development code is chapter 16 and 17 of the city code. We've done the audit. Now this summer and this fall we'll do the hard work of actually updating the code. So ton of stuff happening, and I'm happy to answer questions on any of these or share more information. I'm really proud of just how busy the city has been. We will talk next week about general fund, but I just want to notice a couple of pressures. One is we as a city have made the decision to create the West Side Urban Renewal District. Awesome, but it does come with, it now freezes that tax base for the general fund and for the city. So just recognize that there are implications of that. The Waterfront Urban Renewal District was extended to help finish up and pay for the final parts of that stormwater project. So that also has delayed the release of funds to the general fund. We continue to do a building department subsidy. We'll talk about that. I just said we got legislative funds, the legislature awarded funds for Mariposa Village. We have every confidence that those are going to get rolled over and we will get those. But in the meantime, the city will be, responsible for those. I don't know what's happened. All right. So in the meantime, the city is obligated to those. So we trust that the legislature is going to allow us to have those funds, and release those funds. They awarded them to us last session. We need them to come in the coming year, which means they need to reauthorize those funds. But just know that's kind of sitting out there right now. Hydro is an exciting project that Public Works is working on. In fact, they were out there on the site today for a pre-construction meeting where we'll actually generate electricity through our water system. It's pretty incredible. Energy Trust, and there's some state funds for that, but those are grants on a reimbursement basis. So the city will need to front those dollars either from the water fund or the general fund, and then be reimbursed. One other program this year we talked about was we've established as a middle housing incentive program. The city general fund would make a loan match. We don't know if anybody is going to apply for any of those for the incentive, but we have committed our general fund to that, so we need to acknowledge that. And then finally, as I shared with council at their retreat in December, we are planning to make some investments in our IT. We're going to do a 5-year IT strategic plan in the coming year. We're overdue for that, and a cybersecurity audit. So I anticipate some IT expenses coming in the coming year, and those, for the most part, come out of the general fund. Okay, there we go. So just looking ahead again, very briefly, we will continue to do all that stuff that goes under the iceberg, right under the water, the iceberg under the water. We'll continue those essential services. There's not very much in this year's budget, but know that we are working on space issues. If you are here on a normal day, you'll see that in City Hall, most of the staff is double staffed. They're in cubicles kind of next to each other. And we spend a lot of time on Zoom these days. So that's can be uncomfortable. Police have been squashed in a space that was supposed to be very temporary. That was 10 years ago. Our public works building needs some improvement. So space issues continue to be a problem, and we're going to keep working on that. We will do collective bargaining. So we have 3 unions here, public works and police. Nope, is that right? No, it's fire and all 3 are next year.
No.
Fire and police. 2 of the 3 are come up in January of 2026, and I have a couple more months to figure out who they are. But to know that collective bargaining is it's so critical. I mean, I really value our unions and really appreciate them. But collective bargaining is an expensive process. We use an attorney for that. And we anticipate that they will come with asks, right? Cost of housing, being competitive wages, those things will hit us this year. We'll continue to work on the projects identified in the council work plan for the next 2 years. And then when Adam speaks on the last day, we'll be talking about the projects in the capital improvement plan, and we'll continue to work on those. And then, as I mentioned, council has set a goal of having a possible 2026 bond measure. So those are some of the things that I anticipate trying to make some progress on in the coming year when the next time we get together. Those were just a very quick, like boom, boom, boom. These are the things that I wanted you to know before I handed it over to Chris. Any questions or thoughts? Otherwise, I'll hand it to the expert. Cool, thank you all. Should I just close this and you continue sharing? All right, thank you, Chris.
Thank you. All right, and what I would determine as the first miracle of the process, Abigail and I are gonna talk about a bunch of the same stuff, which is great because we didn't coordinate that. I can go into some more detail. So let me. This is full screen. Is there a way to share the screen again? No, I'm trying to do the PDF. Hold on 1 second.
Sorry.
There's beverages and snacks. There, please help yourself anytime.
is just the share button.
Come down here, share. And then, yep.
Great.
And then if you X that, you'll get the whole screen. You got it.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. there's the share.
My day job ran over, my passenger's eye surgery went wrong. Councilor Rivera just texted that her kid got whacked at Little League and is, so she's not gonna make it.
All right, thank you. Again, I want to do the same thing. I want to thank everyone for participating in the budget committee. It is great to have both public and city council participating. It's great to have most of the council or most of the budget committee back for a second year. So I think this will be very, very valuable. I want to thank those that have already submitted comments in the budget. I would like to encourage any and all questions, comments. Please, no question, sort of is too obvious. That this is a significant work for our staff here. There will be errors that you will uncover in your questions, right? There will be things that will help us to talk to department managers as to why they made certain decisions they made in their budgets. So I do encourage any and all questions that you have, and because it does make the budget sort of more durable, sort of, and it does add to our diligence, and it is great to have sort of a second or several sets of eyes on it. In going through this, really what I want to do is start by just some of the macroeconomic factors that is just driving not just the city, but sort of Oregon in general. So the Oregon Economic Revenue Forecast, which was published in March of 2025, discussed some of the sort of general state macroeconomic drivers. In general, they said that there's a solid economic landscape, but it's subject to sort of a dynamic risk environment. So the economy in general is demonstrating moderate health. Output growth is lagging national averages, but is showing some signs of reacceleration. There's high levels of labor utilization, but job creation is choppy, and it's concentrated in just a few industries. And year over year, non-farm payroll was up only about 0.6%. Of that, private hiring was only up 0.2% year over year. So, the vast majority was government hiring, which is about 2.5%. Sort of given the current environment that Abigail talked about, that, there is likely to see some weakness in the government sector, right? So total private non-farm payroll will be looked for to sort of drive the economy. And there are certain things that are going to be some headwinds in that. Oregon's economy is highly vulnerable to some of the national priorities that are in the headlines. Tariffs. At a state level, exports and manufacturing play outside roles in the state, as opposed to others. Immigration, long-term growth, particularly for Oregon as a state, is very dependent on net migration from other states and overseas. Locally, agriculture, leisure, hospitality, construction is more reliant on foreign-born labor than other industries, and so immigration policies, sort of restrictive migration, immigration will sort of hinder those areas of growth. And then federal expenditures. There's broad sector influence across the state. This is particularly impactful in the eastern counties. Those areas are very, very highly employed, sort of Forest Service, BLM, sort of land stewardship hiring, a lot of government hiring. So at a state level, it could be very, very impactful, particularly in the eastern counties of the state.
Chris, what do you mean by high levels of labor utilization? Does that mean like labor unions, or does that mean like?
No, so it's labor productivity. Right? So to the extent that Oregon has been experiencing sort of growth, it's been not so much job creation, but it's been more the individual productivity of sort of existing labor. So sort of topical and sort of inflation, right? We are coming off of a fairly higher level of inflation. There was the expectation that we were sort of in a downward inflationary environment, that interest rates would continue to come down. That's sort of questionable, right? So there's economic resilience, but there's persistent price pressures. And so it's curtailing expectations for sort of any meaningful additional reductions at the federal level. So as of this morning, federal Fed funds rates were targeted between sort of 4.25% and 4.5%. But at today's meeting, the Fed held rates steady, quoting the risks of higher unemployment and higher inflation, have risen, particularly given sort of the uncertain tariff policies. So this is the third Fed fund meeting. The last rate reduction was in December 2024 when the Fed reduced the rate 1/4 point to where it is now, and it's sort of questionable as to when the next Fed fund rate adjustment's going to be. Where there was expectations that there would be a sort of a quicker reduction in Fed funds and relative inflation, that seems to be sort of on hold and questionable at the moment. So a little bit more uncertainty in the sort of interest rate environment. And then that coincides with household inflation expectations, right? So the headlines and sort of conversations and household inflation expectations have risen, and so that increases the risk of price volatility. It makes inflation control sort of more challenging. So again, it'll be interesting to see how the Fed manages this. I think that when there's a little bit more certainty in what tariff policy is going to look like, maybe this sort of flushes itself out better. Local and regionally, as Abigail discussed, the challenge at the Hood River municipal level is cost of services, managing that with sort of revenues, right? Our cost of services outpacing revenue receipts. And the issue there is property tax constraints, right? We'll have a slide later in this presentation that will really sort of display what the difference is between sort of assessed value and real market values. But because of the constraints of measures 5 and 50, property taxes are restricted to increase at 3%. We've coming off of a period of time where costs did not sort of hold to a 3% increase, right? So, inflationary environments of 8-7%, sort of 4% over the last 3 years have really taxed sort of revenue receipts. Now, Hood River is a little bit in a better position because there are some revenues that are more inflation reflective. So sort of the lodging tax, franchise fees, although they have underperformed inflation lately, are outperforming inflation currently, because most of those franchise fees are around 5% or so. Again, Hood River is not as constrained as most, but we still do see these pressures. And wages and operating costs are not decreasing, right? We're seeing a greater demand for local services rather than a lesser demand. Personnel and benefit costs, particularly benefits costs, are sort of dictated to the city, right? And so they are outpacing inflation in most instances. Same would be for insurance and some other operating expenses. And then there's the reality of sort of where the city is with regards to its need to improve and maintain aging infrastructure. We have a very robust capital improvement plan, but the majority of it is sort of focused on repair and replacement, and sort of building capacity where we can. So we're constantly balancing. Haley is constantly balancing, sort of what are the must-haves versus sort of what are the nice-to-haves, and where can we combine both of those. So we're constantly working on our budgets and our forecasts to be able to make sure that that we are matching our revenues with sort of ongoing expenses. Employment, Hood River unemployment rate is at 3.7%. It's the lowest rate in Oregon. So unemployment is not a factor here really. The driving factors that sort of limit growth and create issues are housing and in a certain, and coincidentally also net in migration, right? So to no one's surprise here, right? New housing supply has not kept pace with demand. Hood River's housing market is, depending on where you read, either the most expensive or second most expensive housing market in Oregon. So that obviously carries with it a significant burden, both for renters, as well as people looking for housing. But also, it lowers net in-migration. It limits the labor force. And so that has an impact on regional growth, right? The labor force isn't expanding. People are not migrating to the region. It puts restrictions. League of Oregon Cities, which tracks populations and does projections, actually decreased Hood River's population or kept it steady roughly, sort of year over year. So what was, sort of consistent 1.2% annual growth, right, seems to be flat, or down at least this year. So we are starting to see that in the numbers. I will go through this very, very quickly. Sort of as Abigail alluded to, the priorities for Hood River are housing, housing, and housing. It is the same at the state level, and the state put together an Oregon housing needs analysis. This was in November of 2022. And the state is looking at that, particularly the governor's office is looking at that housing needs analysis to drive a lot of policy. And so the state's goal is 36,000 homes per year. They're concentrating on rental housing with an $880 million state bond for affordable housing, and $100 million for infrastructure needs related to home building. So they've identified, as much as the city of Hood River has, that the infrastructure is insufficient to support new housing. And so if cities, counties, the state can provide infrastructure, sewers, right? Sort of water to areas that are able to be developed, that will encourage housing. And so at the city level, this is very, very much what's happening with the West Side URA, right? Investments in an area that is natural growth, that would provide infrastructure and incentives for additional housing. But City of Hood River also has certain affordable housing initiatives that are ongoing currently. We will discuss these in the budget. Mariposa Village, 130 units. I'm very proud to say that's going to break ground shortly. So $2.4 million in the SB 1530 funds that have been received, plus $500,000 in county CET that the City of Hood River controls. So almost $3 million of investment in that housing project. And then the middle housing construction incentive that Abigail also mentioned, the Will Norris and the URA has put together a housing incentive program. Got $500,000 of funding from the Oregon Investment Board, and that came with the requirement of a $500,000 general fund loan. And so this is an opportunity for the city to match funds with the Oregon Investment Board to put this construction incentive program together. So you'll see that in the budget. Oh, so that's the construction excise tax. So for construction, there is a 1%, sort of surcharge that goes towards sort of affordable housing. And there are different buckets of affordable housing. So there's developer incentives, and then there's also a state pass-through. So this is an excise tax sort of lobbed onto builders and construction. I'll stop here for a moment if anybody wants to ask any questions, sort of what we talked about so far. I thought that there would be an opportunity for us at this point, because everybody was on the budget committee last year. Normally we do a third quarter review at city council, but I thought because this is collectively everyone's budget, that we would sort of go through it here. We won't spend a lot of time, but I think it'll be interesting because you can sort of see where we are versus the budget that was passed last year. And it'll give sort of a background as to sort of how we're making some of the assumptions that we're making moving forward. So
I got a question while we're passing this around.
yeah.
Given your comments about the kind of like the uncertain dynamic environment, things seem to be more complicated, at the federal level and political level compared to 12 months ago.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about, given all of that background, what are some of the, what are some of the moves that you are proposing the city make, and how are you looking at this budget?
Yeah.
Through the lens of that uncertainty and all of that kind of federal chaos and all of this, what are you presenting that's gonna be, that's different, that
Yeah.
reflects that uncertainty and risk?
So the city's very lucky, right? So from an operating revenues perspective, right? There is not a component that is sort of federal fund generated, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that from a revenue perspective, the biggest issue that we're gonna experience might be anything that comes down from the state, right? So does it sort of impact any state revenues that the city is receiving? Now, again, state revenues are also not a significant component, right? So from an operating standpoint, there isn't really any defensive measures that the city's taking because most of the revenues are not impacted.
Yeah.
So what it really comes down to is more of sort of future planning, and sort of the projects that we're undertaking, right? So, so for example, where we may see an impact is on the this dehydro project, right? So the dehydro project qualified for a tax credit that was for a non-tax-paying entity to collect the tax credit, right? You were gonna basically submit paperwork to the federal government, and the federal government was gonna pay you what the tax credit value is, right? That was part of the sort of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? We're guessing that goes away, right? However, the city still has the tax credit, right? That's embedded in tax credit law, right? So that doesn't go away. So we're exploring whether there's a secondary market for that, right? So instead of getting dollar for dollar on the tax credit, maybe we're gonna get 80 cents, right? So, and on, moving forward, what Haley and I are looking at is how are we capitalizing sort of future infrastructure projects, right? Like, are we looking at federal funds, right? Do we need sort of DEQ dollars for these projects to move forward? Making sure that we don't start projects that we think are going to need federal funds in the future, right? So it's really more on the infrastructure side, where we're trying to figure out sort of where does the money come from, right? And we'll talk a little bit about it with lending too, because it's steering a little bit more away from grants, or the expectation of grants, federal grants, and sort of underwriting more that, hey, we've got to be able to finance these through the revenue that the city's generating, right? So the last part I would say is sort of a reaction response to that is we will do a rate study, because the revenues that water, sewer, storm, right, generate may be required to be leaned on heavier to do infrastructure projects, right, if there is the absence of federal funding. So, but I would say that it's really more long-term planning than it is sort of than immediate, sort of like budget changes.
Yeah.
So
That's really helpful, thank you.
yeah, thank you. Okay, so many of you have not seen this reporting before. Let me just walk through very, very quickly sort of how this is structured. And I will stick to the general fund part of it. So you'll see sort of on the top is revenue. It'll show you budget, actual received through March of this year, and then a year-end estimate. And so the way that the city does year-end estimates is essentially sort of predictive revenue receipts, right? Over the last 6-7 years, what percentage of revenue have we received from an individual revenue category? And what would be the expectation of sort of what that would look like at year-end? So this is sort of a historical projection. And then obviously last is sort of, actual or projected over or under budget. The last column is the prior fiscal year. So let me go through some of the information here. So the Q3 general fund revenue received through March 2025 was $8.5 million. That's in the sort of the second revenue column. That's just 79% of the annual budgeted revenue of 10.8 million, which is shown in your first column. And so through the third quarter, actual revenue receipts were 4% greater than for the same period 1 year earlier, which would be Q3 2024. As we discussed, year-end estimates are based on historical trends and budget estimates, based on Actual revenue received through March and predictive trends, the year-end estimate is about within 0.5% of budget expectations. I'll pretend that that makes us good, right? It could also just make us very lucky. But you know, that's sort of where we are with budget. So happy to report that it looks like we are at or near budget. Now, again, the largest category, property tax, most of that has been received, right? So 96% of that revenue has been received. I would say the areas of question will be transit room tax, if we see any impact on tourism, or unexpected impact on tourism, you know, and maybe you know, sort of parking, right? Again, because those are both tourism related. So future activity as we move into the summer, you know, sort of may impact those categories the most. Parking meter receipts, 20% greater than the same period for the prior year. That's in part to be expected because we increased parking meter prices by a quarter from $1 to $1.25. However, they're still about 10% below the annual budget. We had expected to see sort of utilization and traffic come back to more historical levels, sort of pre-pandemic levels. I don't know that we're seeing that in this environment. So while we expected both the increase in rate and a higher utilization, most of this increase seems to be an increase in rate. We'll talk about that as we sort of look forward in the future budget. Other areas of note, ambulance revenues are about 11% below budget. They've been really consistent over the last couple of years. It is unclear why we're seeing a decline. It's not expected that's sort of permanent. You know, we think it may be an aberration, but again, we're not necessarily sure why that's 10% or 11% below budget. Municipal court revenues are the single largest category that are below budget, although it's not a significant number. They are 47% below the prior year and 24% below budget expectations. There has been some turnover at the police department. There has been some lower sort of activity. The court activity has been down, so revenues at the court have sort of underperformed expectations. On the expenditure side, and now this is sort of the next box down where it sort of discusses expenses. General fund department expenses are all trending below budget through the third quarter. We had put in the budget that there was going to be $175,000 transfer to the building fund because of Mariposa Village's plan check fees and the activity that generated in the building fund. We've conservatively reduced that to $125,000. And so where we originally thought there would be an operating deficit for the year of about $835,000, we are now looking at what we expect to be an operating deficit of about $350,000. But I also want to note that that includes a $400,000 contingency that as of current we have not used or not used much of. And so you know, I am hopeful, excuse me, that we will come in this year at sort of a balanced budget or very, very close to a balanced budget as it relates to the general fund. That would be including the transfers to the building fund and some of the other non-recurring expenses. So to Abigail's point, looking at the third quarter, looking at our existing budget, you know, it does communicate that we have a pretty healthy budget for the city. There's a lot of numbers on this page. Yeah.
If I'm reading this right, your budget almost all categories of the energy side. Are you managing to that? Is that on purpose or what's that telling?
Well, so I think that you know, I mean, I would expect that most of these budgets will sort of come pretty close to what the, you know, so the allocated expenditures are. A lot of it, so for example, fire and police, right? It's a lot of overtime, right? So to a certain extent, we had not used a bunch of overtime for fire. We're being told there probably will be more overtime for fire for the remainder of the year. Some of these are, we've had some vacancies. So there is some sort of savings in payroll because there have been some vacancies that were budgeted to be filled. Some of these are actual sort of savings, but again, you know, to the area like city council, municipal court, engineering, parking, I would probably expect all those to come in sort of under budget. Some of these others like parks, police, and fire probably will have to spend those budgets. So, yeah.
This page doesn't seem to call out the PERS catastrophe, which so many agencies are screaming about. You just have rolled it in with the other costs. Any comments on PERS?
Yeah, so you know, so Will Norris, sort of had, entered into a side agreement with PERS. And so to date, our increases on PERS have been mitigated because of that. You know, sort of one of the things that we'll look at this coming year is what are gonna be the changes in the future. But for the time being, you know, we've been mildly insulated from that.
Thank you.
So. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? So, as Abigail also alluded to, there is in the budget book, there's resolution 2020-07. It's on page 178 of your book, if you ever want to review it. And so it outlines, you know, sort of the financial policies of the city. So things that are involved in and discussed in that resolution that we use as the basis for the budget and sort of the overriding sort of guidelines. One-time resources used for one-time purposes. As Abigail mentioned, and I really want to reiterate this, this is where municipalities, entities, organizations get into big trouble, right? Where it's, you have a windfall event where you've received a grant, or sort of one-time award, and expenses ramp up to that level. And then when the grant award does not renew, right? Or, you know, sort of it goes away, those expenses sort of need to be addressed in some form or fashion, right? And so as a policy, you know, the city is matching one-time resources with one-time purposes, right? The idea of a balanced budget. The resolution discusses general fund ending fund balance and reserves. How do we use reserves? What are the guidelines? How we, you know, what do we want to have for reserves? Again, these are sort of overriding guidelines for the budget, right? Prepare for rainy day, and sort of understand how you're using your reserves. Structurally balanced budget, we just discussed. Establishing fleet and long-term liability charges. So the city does charge as individual department expenses, reserves for things like compensated absences, right? So planning for retirements, funding for retirements, funding for sort of, you know, sort of the expenses that are associated with staff turnover, fleet, right? So there's a, you know, particularly if you look at the city where we have police, fire, public works as the majority of the responsibilities, it's very fleet heavy, and sort of replacement dependent. So those are sort of allocated, funded for, right, to the individual funds ahead of time, so that you're not having this, you know, these large capital expenditures on fleets that they're sort of metered and reserved for. Same thing with compensated absences, as I mentioned. You know, we are thinking about doing an IT reserve that will come out of our IT planning. But, you know, sort of large capital expenditures, we're trying to sort of allocate for those in the budget as reserves, as opposed to very, very large capital, sort of, you know, unbalanced capital expenditures. And then lastly, we'll just go through now, the resolution calls for a 3-year general fund forecast. We have expanded this. Haley and I work very, very hard right now, mostly Haley, to do long-term forecasts for our public works funds, because again, those are project heavy. And so having a longer term time frame on that, sort of, you know, 5 to 8 years, is actually more helpful for us, because that better pairs with, you know, sort of what the durations of those projects might be. At the general fund level, we'll do a 3-year general fund forecast, which is sufficient for the purposes. So general fund revenues. So we talked about last year's budget was about 10.8. We'll expect to receive 10.8. Next year's budget calls for about a 1.2% increase, sort of $10.9 million in general fund revenues. There are 5 revenue sources that represent 86% of the revenue receipts. Property taxes, 33% of revenue receipts, lodging tax at 19%, franchise fees, which includes utility fees. The city charges a 7% fee to the individual public works funds for user payments. So water receipts, sewer receipts, storm receipts, the general fund charges a 7% admin fee. Ambulance billings through the fire department is 9%, and then parking revenue as a separate department is 8% of general fund revenues. So those 5 categories represent 86% of the city's unrestricted revenues. And again, as a reminder, general fund versus utility funds, sort of other reserve funds. The general funds are the unrestricted revenues, right? This is where any sort of discretionary spending, or absolute discretionary spending can be done. It also happens to fund most of the departments, that most of the population sort of interacts with, right? Fire, police, parks, etc. So on the projections, so we talked about, sort of a fairly flat 1.2% increase in general fund revenue year over year. Some of the major categories are not changing significantly. We'll talk about parking, where parking fees are generally flat. Actually, let me go to projections. So sorry, I don't know if you can still see the graph here, but so for next year, for the current fiscal year budget we'll talk about, there's a 3.5% assessed value increase on the tax base for the fiscal year 26. I want to talk about two important URA impacts. We had originally assumed in last year's budget that the waterfront urban renewal area would close, and that tax base would accrue to the general fund. The waterfront has been extended an additional year. And so it'll be next year, excuse me, when $88 million in additional assessed value will accrue to the city. That's an increase in the assessment base of about 6%, I believe. A 6% increase in assessment values. The West Side URA, conversely, its formation has frozen $158 million in the tax base. And so the city's assessed value is about $1.5 billion currently. So that's roughly about 10%. Impacts in the immediate term are not as significant. But again, in the longer term is when you sort of see some additional impacts for that, because that base is frozen, right? So the 3%, excuse me. I apologize if this is a review for people that are very familiar with urban renewal districts, but the idea being is when urban renewal districts are formed, the tax base is frozen to the city, and any additional increase in the tax base accrues to the urban renewal area. So the increase in assessed value of 3% that normally would go to the city's coffers, right, accrue to the urban renewal area. Now that's oversimplifying it a little bit, but the other aspect of it is that urban renewal areas are usually developing, right? And development is really one of the only ways that properties get reassessed for purposes of tax revenue. So that also tends to be a larger growth area of property tax. And so the impacts over time, right, are significant to both the URA, right, and the general fund. So we will talk about that a lot in the future. But anyway, the large increase in revenue in fiscal 27 is largely driven by the waterfront coming back to the tax rolls. Lodging taxes, we've assumed a 2% growth. Effectively, it's flat year to year. And the addition of the 2% growth, the increase of 2% growth is a little bit of optimism, but also the addition of 69 keys or hotel rooms at the Lightwell downtown. And so we are seeing some additional inventory. Oh, excuse me. And so we're adjusting for that additional inventory, and it's making the assumption that additional inventory is accretive to the overall tax revenue receipt and not sort of cannibalistic on existing sort of, right? So the idea being is that we're actually pulling from surrounding areas, staying in Hood River, excuse me, as opposed to pulling from other hotels in the area. Parking revenue, we had a 25% increase. I'm sorry, 25-cent increase in the hourly rate in this current fiscal year. As I mentioned, we haven't seen any increase in utilization. We're just calling that to be flat.
Does that have to do with all the construction downtown? Was that an effect on the parking, or?
I mean, unclear. You know, I think the ODOT work doesn't help, right? And so, but it hasn't been just recently. You know, we've sort of, we'd expected to see that increase significantly throughout the year, and we haven't. It's been a trend. Excuse me, it's been a trend for the last couple of years.
Does the metering of parking, and the use of apps and things make it so that people don't have as many tickets, and if they don't have as many tickets, are the tickets the same pot, or are they another pot?
It's all the same fund.
Okay.
Okay, but the actual, the $695,000 is meter revenue. We have actually, to tell you the truth, with the apps, we have seen, a decrease in ticket issuances. It has been more efficient for people to pay. Now, presumably that should be offset by people paying more often, right? Because it's easier for people to pay. But again, you know, there are pre-pandemic levels of parking revenue that we're just beginning to eclipse now. And that, you know, you would expect activity to be higher.
I think some of it is attributable to different transportation options. Well, we're using e-bikes these days.
I mean,
Different public transportation options. It's kind of been.
You would hope, right? I mean, from a, you know,
That doesn't sound fun.
no, I mean, from a city perspective, right, I can't tell. Right now, we are going to be looking sort of at parking and parking studies, and maybe we'll get some information from that. But you know, as of right now, I cannot tell you. So overall, 1.2% growth year over year, right? So essentially flat year over year on revenue expectations. But moving forward, 5% increase projected in fiscal year 27, again, largely attributable to the waterfront URA, returning to the tax rolls, and then a 2.6 increase in fiscal year 28, you know, sort of just expected sort of, you know, sort of 3% improvement, you know, sort of just general assumptions. So, oh, and then on restricted revenues. So restricted revenues, 4.6% average annual growth. Again, we're looking at relatively flat revenue expectations from this current fiscal year to next fiscal year. So this current fiscal year was $10.3 million in restricted revenue growth. Again, this is gas tax, water user revenue, sewer user revenue, and storm revenue. This is the last year of a 5-year utilities plan. So most of the rates have adjusted over that period of time to the target rate. And so there are very, very small increases, mostly on industrial users. For this year, most of the increases to the user base is flat. And again, we will revisit that in a rate study that we would expect to do this year. This is just what we talked about, right? So this is the final year of our 5-year rate study. You know, the rate study had targeted a 4.4 increase for water and sewer over its lifespan. A larger increase for stormwater. Most of those increases have occurred before this fiscal year. This fiscal year is relatively flat for sewer, flat for water, and a 3% stormwater increase, but that comes off a 14% increase in the last fiscal year. So most of these rates have adjusted to what the rate study had targeted. Other restricted government revenues, state and local gas tax. These are based on sort of state fuel tax growth rates. These are predictions based on League of Oregon Cities. It is unclear, right, how electric cars and the prevalence of electric cars affects this. But in general, these are projected to flatten over the forecast period. This will be an area of discussion in future years, right? So as cities look to figure how to create road fund revenue, because it won't be coming from the gas tax or be coming from a diminishing gas tax, this will be an area of focus in future years. And so whether, you know, some municipalities are implementing a transportation utility fee, which is a sort of a user charge to residents, you know, others are sort of trying to assess, you know, how to collect from the prevalence of electric vehicles. But I would expect that there will be more on this in future years. So general fund expenses and as we look at the forecast, personnel services, right? So it's anywhere between 65 to 70% of general fund operating expenses are personnel. This year, we're seeing a 6.4% increase in all base wages. What goes into that? Sort of COLA increases, CBA dictated increases, so the collective bargaining agreement increases, employee wage steps, right? So employees that are sort of stepping up on the wage scale. And then above and beyond that is sort of other benefits and then city costs. So insurance, the city is experiencing a 9% increase in health insurance. The way that runs on a calendar year, so it impacts the budget, sort of as a 6-month expense. But again, right, 9% increase, significantly higher than inflation. And a 4% increase in insurance premiums. This is actually lower than anticipated. We're seeing relatively moderate increases in insurance premiums, particularly compared to last year. Property liability is still up 5.3%, excess liability 4%, auto 4.3%. So as we look at reoccurring revenues versus reoccurring expenses, it is just about sort of a balanced budget. It is going to be heavily managed, right? So the forecast period beyond 2 years makes some fairly aggressive assumptions with regards to how do you keep operating expenses as the same as revenues when revenues are growing at 3 to 3.5% a year, and so how are you managing operating expenses that sort of over the last couple of years have outpaced inflation? So this will be the challenge. As Abigail and I were discussing, the general fund is not going to be very exciting. It's going to be more of sort of how do you match the operating expenses, right? It's just a cost of doing the daily business of the city. Whereas the URA will be much more exciting because that will be the funds that the city will have to really sort of incentivize housing development, right? Infrastructure. And so a lot of the activity at the city level will migrate to the URA. I think from the general fund. It's just the reality.
Chris, do you see more risk on the expenditure side? Revenue side, what gives you concern?
Inflation, right? I mean, I think that it is the restrictive ballot measures, right? Or restrictive, like sort of, Prop 5 and 50, that really restrict how the cities can grow revenue. And so it's going to be either the city just starts charging users higher fees, right? When push comes to shove. But you're trying to alleviate the burden on the population, right? And so we will see that and we'll try to manage that when we're doing the rate study. Right? We've got a lot of infrastructure that needs to be done at the city. But rates charged to users can only be so high before it becomes a burden into the community, right? So where do you go? If you can't draw additional revenue from property taxes because that's significantly below appraised value, and you can't burden your community with additional fees for the services that you're providing, right? What's next, right? And if the state's not going to be providing, is the state's going to be providing less revenue. So I think that's the thing that's concerned, right? Is that it's a being creative doesn't help you, right? How do you fund the services?
Okay.
Question. Debt service is not rolled into this, is it?
Well, so interestingly enough, the general fund in itself has very, very minimal debt service. And we'll talk about it in an upcoming slide, but most of the debt service is on the restricted revenue side.
Yeah.
And so that is being paid by water fees, sewer fees, stormwater fees, right? And so what Haley and I do when we're looking at projects is we're sort of seeing what type of relative debt service coverages those funds can realistically afford. And so that's where most of the debt is, right?
Because they're restricted, they need to be balanced, so we should feel good about the debt service capacity and capability of those funds. And given that there's like little debt service rolled into the general fund overall, like from like a balance sheet standpoint, feeling pretty good about overall debt.
Yes, we are. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that, because there are some challenges. And as the city moves forward, I think debt will be a more prevalent part of the discussions, again, because of, sort of substituting for federal funds and substituting for what the city can finance on its own. But yes, but the city is in a very, very good position, as it relates to debt.
Okay, and then just like a follow on, since we're on this,
Yeah.
you've got like there's $1 million unappropriated ending general fund balance delta between what you expect to end with this year and next year's budget. You're looking at ending at 3.9 million and then starting at a $5 million beginning fund balance
Yeah.
general fund next year.
Mhm.
Why is there such a, what's the deal with that?
Yeah, so it's not that far off. It's what we predicted last year, right? And so I think that a lot of it, a lot of things are baked into the budget that are sort of, I don't want to say worst case scenario, but sort of defensive, right?
Yeah.
So for example, the general fund carries a $400,000 contingency, right?
Right.
Over the last couple of years, the city has not spent that contingency.
Right.
Right, and so, so that's an adjustment. I would say another big, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, right, but another big change in the general fund is that the building fund is going to need subsidy.
Right. Yeah.
Right, and so that's a $300,000 number.
Okay.
And so it's, the bulk of it really is that. Now, from this type of analysis, right, those type of things are not considered reoccurring.
Yeah, they flush out.
Right, and so when we're talking about, when we're talking about the budget in the general fund, and we're looking at sort of $1 million sort of reliance on the fund balance, right? It's not necessarily reoccurring. Not much has changed this year at the staffing level. So the city maintains 74 full-time equivalent positions. It is, sort of, I would say 85% of that is police, fire, public works, and admin. There was it did reduce this year by 0.8. There was a part-time IT manager that was carried on the FTE, and that rolled off this year. We'll talk about how we're managing IT this, but that's the only change, was sort of a part-time IT manager that's no longer on the full-time equivalent. But the city this year will operate very, very similar to last year at 74 full-time equivalents. Okay, debt. So two things I want to talk about here. So the green line is the city's statutory debt limit, right? And so the statutory debt limit is defined by the real market value of the property as opposed to the assessed market value. So property taxes are assessed market value. The debt limit is determined by real market value. So, as you can see, sort of real market value significantly outpaced, as values sort of increased, as home values increased over time. So there is no restraint or constraint with regards to how much the city can borrow. It's more of a function of what can the city afford as it relates to what's sort of paying debt. The last major debt financing that the city incurred, if you look at sort of 2010, 2011, the US had the City of Hood River took out 3 USDA loans. I want to say the principal balance was somewhere around $15 million between the water and the sewer funds. Those are 40-year financing terms at 2.25%, so pretty favorable loan terms. And so that, sort of the vast majority of the debt are in, sort of in those categories. To date, the city has self-funded a lot of the projects as it relates to water and sewer, and that will change this year. So we will be looking at, working within the availability of the water and sewer funds to fund a bunch of our projects. This year's budget includes about $10.5 million worth of assumed borrowing. So that's $2 million in the road fund. That loan has actually been approved. That is through ODOT for an ODOT project. $5.5 million in the sewer fund, sort of TBD, sort of where that comes from. We are currently talking to a couple lenders. About $1,750,000 in the water fund. That excludes some bridge financing for the dehydro project. In all, about $8.25 million of financing for this year. Excuse me, that would be serviced by user fees. So there is dedicated restricted revenue that would be used to pay that debt service, and that is outside of the general fund. So as it relates, when we talk about infrastructure projects, when we talk about the sort of long-term planning, it is looking at those existing user fees and conservative debt coverage ratios as far as what type of debt the cities could support. So as we look at debt in the future, it is outside the general fund and looking towards these sources of revenue. Okay, so I'm going to move to an individual department. So I guess that's sort of fund and or the citywide. Are there any sort of questions or comments or discussions that we want to have before we sort of dive into the admin fund?
Yes, one.
Yeah.
So just thinking about the preparation, you mentioned all of this and everything, thank you so much. All works great. Do you feel supported in terms of like the software and technology that you have to prepare forecasts and FP&A, and are you just grinding it out in Excel? Like, how do you feel supported by technology?
Oh, I think that's a good question. Will Norris developed a budget sort of module that we use to prepare the budgets. So for our needs as they exist today, that's been sufficient. And it's a good tool, and sort of works well. We actually did look at a sort of a budget module. For our needs at the moment, they're a little expensive, and it's difficult because if they don't coordinate with your accounting software, right, then they're almost useless. And there weren't a lot that were sort of in a reasonable price level, right? So we'll continue to look at it. But more importantly, IT in general is an issue, right? And so it is a significant part of our budget. I'll talk about it now when we talk about the administration. But we are at the end of our 5-year plan. There is going to be some significant IT infrastructure that needs to be invested. It is unclear what we will need to do on a security side, and what some of the other sort of recommended investments might be that come out of it. And we're a relatively skinny budget, right? And so these are you'll see and when we talk about administration, IT is a significant part, of sort of what we're funding, or how we're operating, and we're probably not spending enough, quite frankly. So. All right, so administration department. This is actually in your budget book on pages 110 to 114. So the administration fund is both outside the general fund, but in the general fund. It's in all the funds. And so, when we look at the administration, which is Fund 805, you would typically consider these type of expenses overhead in a business context, right? So a lot of the general operations, administration, finance, human resources, IT, legal services, all exist in the admin department, and then get allocated to the individual funds as an expense, right? And so the individual funds will then fund this to the admin fund as an allocated expense based on sort of their percentage. So administrative costs are totaled and expense allocated to these individual departments. That includes the urban renewal area. So all areas of the city. And overall, it's about 4.5% of the total citywide personnel, material and services and capital expenses sort of exists within the administration fund. So for this calendar year, the administrative charges to the individual funds is a little over $2 million. Again, that's 4.5% of the total citywide personnel, material and services and capital expenses. That's up from last year from about 4%. 86% of these charges are allocated to the city departments and funds. 14% is allocated to the URA. Notably, that is up this year because of the creation of the West Side. And we'll see what happens next year when Waterfront sort of closes, but the operations of the West Side expand. The pie chart here just sort of shows the individual allocations by department. But again, as we talk about budgets and managing budgets, the administrative budget and the charges that exist in it are borne by all of the funds and all of the city departments. All right, so what's in here? Payroll expense is about 56% of the total administration budget. So 7.2 FTE of the 74 total city FTE are in the admin fund. Payroll expenses are up 9% year over year. Again, it's not just the COLA increases, but it's also sort of benefits increases. It is steps, promotions, etc. are all in. I should note here. I should note that this year for non-union, non-represented employees, that COLA is established by sort of us in the budget committee. So public works, fire, police, those increases are dictated by the collective bargaining agreement. So one of the budgetary decisions is what is going to be the COLA for the non-represented employees. In this budget, we are proposing a 4% COLA increase. That is slightly higher than inflation, which I think was like 2.8%. However, it is the adjustment that is required to catch up for the lower than inflation COLA increases that the city gave its employees sort of in the period from 2019 forward. So in the areas when inflation was sort of 8%, 6%, COLA was 3%, 4%, or 5%. We did a 5% COLA last year. That did not catch us up. So we're proposing a 4% COLA increase this year, increase this year, which would bring us on par with sort of inflation adjusted to sort of catch up. Now I want to mention as well that has been the perspective behind a lot of the collective bargaining agreements. So the perspective is that we're trying to bring our non-represented employees on par with sort of what the union representatives have negotiated for their employees, or sorry, for their representatives. Okay, material and services. So IT services, $115,000. We currently outsource our IT operations or sort of management. The vast majority of that, I think 105,000 of that is that. Professional services, $160,000. In what's in there, so $35,000 is in bond advisory, as Abigail mentioned in her presentation. One of the council initiatives is to explore a potential bond offering. So this would go towards furthering that. We have been carrying as a carryover grant writing services for $35,000. We would like the opportunity to chase grants as they are available. Translation services are in there. The largest portion of that, though, is $71,000 in change for an IT 5-year plan and security review. As I mentioned earlier, there's a 5-year study that has expired. We are looking to get a new 5-year plan. In addition, the city would like to include in that as part of a just general cybersecurity review. And again, with, sort of, recommendations as to what the city may, sort of may need, with regards to, keeping current on, cybersecurity. Legal services, $115,000. We've seen more, litigious activity, for lack of a. And so, we've increased the general legal to about $70,000. There are a couple on, as Abigail mentioned, there's an ongoing lawsuit. So, that's how we're responding, I guess, with regards to budgeting for general legal. In addition to that, we have $15,000 for just general labor attorney. And then with the CBA, and it is, I believe it was, fire and public works. $35,000 for, sort of, legal associated with just negotiating those collective bargaining agreements.
Chris, can I note that with the Hannah Baker lawsuit, that is a federal lawsuit, we needed to hire an attorney who was admitted to the federal bar, so that was an additional cost beyond our city, our normal city attorney did a lot of the legwork, but we had to be represented by someone admitted to the federal bar.
Audit services, we do an annual audit. It is extensive, it is painful, but it is reassuring, right? And so, the city will see benefits on that, as it relates to borrowing, as it relates to communications with, sort of, federal agencies, other municipalities, and then obviously lenders. And it is, outlined in our, financial policies, that we will do an audit. As I mentioned, I'm very, very proud that we've had clean audits. We work very hard at it, but it is expensive. New to the administration budget is debt service. It is not really debt. So there were changes in accounting standards, GASB 96, GASB 87, that required the city to treat leases, but more importantly, subscription-based IT agreements as debt. This previously was carried as expenses at the individual department. Individual departments that sort of had the subscriptions. The majority of it was in the admin, but it is now all debt service. And so when we see debt service of $120,000, right, it is not debt necessarily. It is how we need to treat, these subscription agreements. So this $119,000 is not new expense. The vast majority of it is existing expenses. It's just reallocated and shown as debt service. You will also see some revenue in the admin that is associated with the payments from other departments of those expenses that are now being carried by the admin fund. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'd really rather not. It has been a significant issue for us in the accounting department, particularly as it relates to the last audit.
Chris, I think when we say leases here, we're talking about like our
Copier lease, yeah.
This is not, the city doesn't lease real estate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it did, it would treat the same way.
Come here, but
Yeah. So again, I just want to reiterate that service is not new expense, it's existing expense. It's just where it's reflected in the fund. And then lastly, there's capital outlay. We have IT equipment replacements. It's about $35,000. There's a server replacement. There are some wireless spot replacements, sort of general recommendations that we've received from our IT consultant that we've talked through and worked through diligence, and these are the ones that we're including in the budget. So again, of the admin budget, 56% is payroll, sort of another 12 to 15% is in sort of IT audit and professional services. And the next large category is sort of legal, and then these sort of debt service categories for these subscriptions. There is also in the admin budget a 5% contingency, again, that we carry sort of sized appropriately for what we think what the fund should carry. So that is it for what we wanted to cover today. So next week, the general fund departments, police, fire, planning, other general fund and the building department. That's outside the general fund, and then and then 2 weeks time, public works, and sort of final deliberations. So I will stop here, for sort of any additional comments and questions.
Last year's, you guys have talked about wanting that lot on Cascade, and Abigail mentioned that that's having trouble, so is this a chance to make a move on that?
Do you mean a jurisdictional transfer to?
Yeah.
From ODOT? We are, this year, we're focused on a transfer from ODOT to the city for the heights 12th and 13th,
Sure.
which is OR 281, I think. In fact, we have a request to the legislature for 30 million and 30.6 million. We do anticipate longer term taking Cascade, a similar process. We have not yet started that, in part because we've not studied what we want to do with Cascade, what's the state of Cascade, but it would be similar, hopeful that that simply come with some dollars because it has been neglected by ODOT. We'll have to do some work to bring it up to the city standard, but we have not pursued that yet. Definitely coming, because we want a roundabout at Mount Adams and Cascade.
I think he's also referencing the ODOT lot though,
Oh, the lot, I'm sorry. Yeah, the yard that they have there. I believe the city pursued that, it was before my time, I don't know if you were on council, mayor. Tried to purchase that lot from ODOT. It required both that the city would buy it at fair market value plus the relocation costs to relocate ODOT. And the cost at that time, which I think was 2018 or so, was more than $8 million.
Okay.
We have tried to advocate through, the governor is really interested in could state parcels, properties be surplus for housing needs. And this particular parcel has been used as a poster child for what could be possible. A prime piece of real estate, fantastic for multifamily housing, but ODOT and the state rules about it lock it up and make it so unaffordable that we can't actually access it. So we're not in active conversation with ODOT about trying to purchase or transfer that property, but I know the governor's office has got that as one of the possible things that could move housing forward. And Governor Kotek is very motivated to move on housing. So we're hopeful that at some point it could either come with the city's control or it could be sold for $1 to the housing authority or someone else to develop.
So more on the political side of that, I'm the chair of the local housing authority, which is the group that's involved in Mariposa Village, and the way we do public housing in this country is unbelievably complicated, but we have a local active group and I'm actively involved in that. The former head of that, the staffer head of that, served on like the public facilities possible to use for low-income housing, like the governor formed a committee and our staffer was on that committee, so very much like a seat at the table. And through that committee's work and our local guys' work, as Abigail said, this ODOT yard came up like top of the list of the pot. So it's super political. ODOT has so much power and so much obligation and so much money and so many challenges. It's just, there's a lot of voices in that conversation.
Our local guy now works for the governor.
Yeah. So, hope.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Every time I drive by it, it is an underused parcel.
I don't think, how come they don't clean up the garbage? I heard a message that I wanted to share with you all. Thanks so much for volunteering for this. The school budget committee, which is, another way some folks spend time with it. They just passed their budget this week. They're like right around about $105 million. The city, everything is about $45 million. So as like a concept, like the corporation of our public schools is about 2.5 times as big as the corporation of the city. And I just think in terms of how our world works, that's such an interesting idea. And when your property tax bill comes towards the end of the year, look at what we each pay in property tax, there are many lines on there, the big line is education. And city is also a big line, but the concept of the general context and scale and scope of the different entities. I don't have the county number right at the tip of my brain now, but understanding that, I think this is super interesting.
And that's a budget that's subjected to cuts, right?
Yeah.
But
Like 4%, right?
I think like 48 people up to that eliminated or shifted, there was a big impact this year at the schools.
I'll make one last comment just on process. So please feel free to email me or Abigail with any questions you have. As a policy, we will, sort of aggregate questions, sort of answer them as sort of best as able, and then we'll circulate all the answers to everybody on committee. So, again, please, like I welcome any questions you have. That helps us sort of examine the budget, helps us defend the budget, helps us, sort of discover possible errors in the budget. But like I said, every question that you submit will get circulated to everybody. So, without your name. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time and volunteering for this. So, thank you.
Is there anything else? Will I move to adjourn the meeting at recess meeting at 7:35 p.m.
All right, see you next week.